The lawsuits continue to pile up against Elon Musk's chainsaw approach to cutting the size of the federal government, and some government lawyers are having a hard time in court. As the Wall Street Journal notes, during fast-moving proceedings, DOJ lawyers at times have struggled on questions of law and fact about what Trump and his lieutenants are actually doing, drawing frustration and rebukes from judges across the country. In some cases, lawyers later submitted corrections to what they have told the courts. Joining me now, Barbara McQuaid, former U.S. attorney and MSNBC legal analyst. So in court, Barbara, these lawyers apparently are unable to answer some basic questions, or they're providing just wrong answers. Do judges have a lot of patience for that kind of thing?
No, not at all, Chris. I have a lot of sympathy for these lawyers. Lawyers on behalf of the government represent the interests of the United States, regardless of who is president. And they work with agencies to find facts. Now, as officers of the court, they have an obligation to provide accurate, truthful responses to judges. And so they do their best to prepare, but when a judge asks a question, if they don't know the answer, they're supposed to go back and find it. But what it sounds like from this reporting is it's difficult finding the answer to these questions because there is a lack of transparency and because the narrative keeps shifting about how many employees are affected or who's making these decisions. So I feel for these lawyers who are supposed to be in there representing the United States to the best of their ability, and they're being forced to do it with one arm tied behind their back.
I mean, it does sound like there is a deluge of lawsuits. I mean, could this just be, in part at least, just not able to keep up?
Yes, and so at a time when we are seeing this diminishing of federal employees, the deferred resignation program, the rescinding of offers of new Department of Justice lawyers, and even the potential to fire department lawyers who are still in their probationary period. What they really need is more lawyers because of all of the unprecedented actions that Donald Trump is taking with his executive orders. People are filing lawsuits. And who defends those lawsuits? Lawyers from the Department of Justice. And so it's very difficult for them, especially when they're seeing a depletion in their ranks. You know, Chris, when I was in law school, I interned for the Department of Justice. And what caught my eye and intrigued me to do this work was a brochure that said, "Our Nation's Litigators." And it talked about the important role of lawyers for the Department of Justice in acting without fear or favor in upholding the rule of law. The Justice Department here is facing a very difficult challenge when they've got people who will not tell the public the truth about what's really going on and won't even tell their lawyers.
Yeah, you never want to go into court unprepared. I think that statement speaks for itself. Having said that, if you do go in and you can't answer a question, or you make an outright mistake that you have to go back, and we have seen this happen, they go back and they correct it, could that impact a judge's ruling if the case is a close call?
Well, it certainly could. You know, judges are human beings, and human beings get frustrated. And so if they find now, my guess is lawyers are answering questions to the best of their ability, but simply lack the answers. But if they don't know the answers to questions that judges find important, and if they're unable to get answers to those questions that the judges need to make their decisions, I think.
There's more breaking news coming into the Situation Room right now. We just got an important ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court on President Trump's attempt to remove a top federal watchdog. Our chief Supreme Court analyst, Joan Biskupic, is joining us right now. So what did the High Court just say, Joan?
Sure. Good to see you, Wolf. This is the very first Supreme Court test of Donald Trump's second-term agenda. And I can tell you that the justices already were struggling. They essentially punted. This case, as you said, involved President Trump's ability to remove an appointee of President Biden who should have been able to serve a full 5-year term. He was just appointed last year, but Donald Trump is trying to remove this man. And lower courts had put a pause on Donald Trump's effort. He had come to the Supreme Court, then appealing, and the justices said, we're not going to quite decide yet. We're going to let this man, Hampton Dellinger, who's over this watchdog agency, stay in place for now. But we're going to revisit this probably after next Wednesday, when a lower court is going to have a hearing on the merits of this case over whether President Trump can remove this individual. This all goes to, as you know, Wolf, Donald Trump's efforts to really flex his executive branch authority. He's trying to remove so many people from offices. This is one of literally dozens of lawsuits that are now percolating. And in this first one, the justices were not quite ready to say the extent of President Trump's power, but they did. This is a partial win for the challengers to Donald Trump, because they're letting this individual, Hampton Dellinger, stay in office. So you know what the president had wanted was for the court to immediately say he has to go. Now there was a split in how the justices decided this, and let me just lay it out. First of all, it was an unsigned opinion, but the majority was saying that it needed to postpone any action till at least next week. Justices Gorsuch and Alito, two conservatives, said that they would have sided with President Trump and let him act in this case. Two of the strongest liberals, Justices Sotomayor and Jackson, said they would have totally sided with the challengers here, with Mr. Dellinger. So it shows you that we get a little bit of a glimpse of some of the dilemma of the justices in this first major test, and we're just going to keep seeing them come week after week after week, Wolf.
Sure we will. All right, Joan, thank you very much for that update. I want to bring in our legal experts to assess what's going on. Jennifer Rogers, how big of a setback potentially is this for the Trump administration?
Well, we don't know yet, Wolf. They've really just put it on pause. This isn't the merits of the matter. This case came up on a temporary restraining order, and there's a question as to whether a temporary restraining order is even appealable in the first case. So that may be where the justices kind of got sideways. Some of them wanted to hear it on this basis. Others maybe didn't. That may be why they've come out the way they did right now. But we won't know until they take the case on the merits what the court thinks of what the case is really about, which is what obstacles can Congress place in the way of the president in firing someone like the special counsel. There's been kind of a narrowing over the years of Congress's ability to stop the president from firing people inside of the executive branch. And so we won't know until we actually get a merits ruling what the court is going to do on that question.
Steve Vladeck is also with us. He's an expert on the Supreme Court. You know the court well, Steve. Are you surprised, first of all, by this?
A little surprised, Wolf. I mean, I think it's odd for the court to issue a ruling that says we're not going to issue a ruling. But I think, Jennifer's right that the procedural way this got to the court has a lot to do with why the middle of the court has acted the way it did. I think you had some real wariness, not just from one end of the court, from the other, of what would happen if the court started inviting the Trump administration or other litigants to come up to the court, even when all that's happened in the first lower court is a temporary restraining order. And so, Wolf, I'm a little surprised that they're deciding to not decide. But I think two critical points are the one Jennifer made, that they're still going to have to decide this sooner rather than later. And Wolf, two, this is about as good a case as there is for the Trump administration when it comes to the strength of the arguments against the removal protection for the special counsel. There's a reason why the Department of Justice wanted to bring this case to the justices first. Even if the court ultimately sides with President Trump, we shouldn't assume that that's an indicator of where it's going to go in the rest of its cases. In the flip side, Wolf, if Hampton Dellinger survives, if the court actually sides with Dellinger as early as next week, that's not just a big blow to Trump here. That is a sign that this court's going to be much more aggressive, pushing back against President Trump than I think a lot of people might expect.
Elise Adamson is still with us as well. Elise, as you know, many of the conservative justices on the Supreme Court have traditionally favored executive power, certainly in past cases. So what does that tell you about what they may ultimately decide in this case?
Yes, Wolf, and I think we saw that just in what we just heard from the reporting with Gorsuch and Alito, willing to take up the case on the merits rather than deciding to not decide. It's just been described. I do think that we have seen an extreme expansion in the interpretation of executive power, and this is a real test. There's a federal law that created this Office of Special Counsel, and Congress tried to make very clear the reasons why an individual could be terminated. They tried to outline this. And so this is going to be a test of the separation of powers. And so I think we can expect to see this court continue on their streak of their interpretation of executive power. And I do think there is a chance that the Supreme Court will rule in the Trump administration's favor.
That's a massive loss for Trump, and he is not happy. He is absolutely furious at the Supreme Court. All 9 of them, but especially the 6 conservatives, and especially the 3 of the 6 that he directly put on the court, right? Like, we know there's 3 conservatives that predate Trump, right? There's 3 liberals, and then there's the 3 conservatives that Trump put on the court in his first term, right? And so it's 2/3 in his favor, but they've gone against him here. They keep going against him on a lot of cases, not every case. And I want to clarify this. This is not about, oh, the Supreme Court is finally standing up to Trump and they're finally going to be responsible. No, this is not about rehabilitating the 6 ghouls on that court, but rather it's about understanding the civil war going on in the conservative movement. And the Supreme Court, which is not above politics, you got to get that fairy tale out of your mind, right? We all have to do that. The Supreme Court is every bit as political as the House, the Senate, and the White House. They just aren't elected, and they serve much longer terms. But they are politicians now. Maybe they weren't always, but they certainly have been for the last 25 years. Since Bush v. Gore, they've been politicians. And the reality is, they're saying, Donald, you're making our job as conservative politicians who happen to wear robes but were politicians nonetheless, you're making our job harder. You force us to take crazy positions or stand up to our president, and we are tired of it. When we had normal Republican presidents, we could kind of just do what we wanted because they wouldn't bring as often ridiculous cases to us. So, Trump's loss at the Supreme Court is another field in the civil war around MAGA.